The sound of a cracking knee isn't particularly pleasant. But it gets worse when you listen up close. It does for most people. But for me, it just makes me excited. Omer Inan, an electrical engineer at Georgia Tech. I actually feel like there's some real information in them that can be exploited for the purposes of helping people with rehab. Inan's experience with cracking knees goes back to his days as an undergrad at Stanford, where he threw discus. If I had a really hard workout, then the next day of course I'd be sore, but I'd also sometimes feel this basically catching or popping or creaking every now and then in my knee. A few years later, he found himself building tiny microphones at a high-end audio company. What we think it is the cartilage and bone rubbing against each other, the surfaces inside the knee rubbing against each other, during those movements. He and a team of physiologists and engineers built a prototype with stretchy athletic tape and a few tiny mics and skin sensors. And preliminary tests on athletes suggest the squishy sounds the device picks up are more erratic, and more irregular, in an injured knee than in a healthy one, which Inan says might allow patients and doctors to track healing after surgery. Details appear in the IEEE Transactions on Biomedical Engineering. The primary application we're targeting at first is to give people a decision aid during rehabilitation, following an acute knee injury, to help them understand when they can perform particular activities, and when they can move to different intensities of particular activities. The lecture is all about cracking knees. To begin with, he mentioned the sound contains numerous information which can be exploited for the purposes of helping people with rehabilitation. In addition to this, he and his team built a prototype with stretchy athletic tape and a few tiny mics and skin sensors. This prototype allows patients and doctors to track healing after surgery. Overall, the primary application they are targeting at first is to give people a decision aid during rehabilitation.
A language dies when the last person who speaks it dies. But you know, sometimes people say it dies when the second last person who speaks it dies, because the last person has nobody to talk to. Well, there are about 6,000 languages in the world at the moment, more or less. Nobody knows the exact number. Of these, about half of them are so seriously in danger, are likely to die out in the course of present century. Now the present century is 100 years, half is 3,000 languages. So, that means one language is dying out somewhere in the world average every 2 weeks. There are all kinds of reasons why languages die. One is physical reason when people are affected by famine, disease and earthquake. Another is genocide, when some countries deliberately stamp out a small language. The main reason is globalization. That is, some huge languages in the world, like English, Arabic, Spanish, and French, and these are like steamrollers crushing the smaller languages they find in their path. A great deal can be done to preserve endangered language. The first thing is that the people themselves must want the language to be preserved. That's very important. The second thing is that the powers that be must want the language to be preserved. They must be respect for the minority languages in their care. The third thing has to be there, of course, is cash. It costs quite a lot of money to preserve an endangered language. The lecture is all about language extinction. To initiate with, she mentioned that there are approximately 6,000 languages in the world at the moment. In addition to this, she talked about the half of languages that were almost dying out. Also, the speaker mentions this is mainly because of urbanization. At last, she suggested that without money, endangered languages don't have a positive future.
Let's say if I'm asking which source you often use to get information. Newspaper? Radio? TV? And the survey shows 62% of the people chose internet. You might be thinking I am going to say how important the internet is, or how quickly it has changed the world for a few years. But what if I tell you this survey is conducted on the website globalandmail.com? Our answer will be different because the people who did this survey on a website must be frequent users of the internet. This sample is a biased sample. So, we have to pay attention to how a survey is conducted. The lecturer was delineating the survey on media in detail. The survey includes different types of sources, which often used to get information such as internet, newspaper, radio, TV, and many more. The report suggests that approximately 62% of people chose the internet. At last, this survey is conducted on the website www.globalandmail.com.
So, let me about the polar regions, just to clarify exactly what we mean. And we have first of all the Arctic at the top of the Earth and the Antarctic at the bottom, and so the Arctic was named after the Greek word for bear. Now surprisingly it's not after the polar bears that live in the Antarctic or live in the Arctic, and based on it's after the Little and Great Bear constellations that can be seen in the sky. Now the Greek also hypothesized that there would be the Anti-Arctic, which is how we get the name Antarctica, and of course it wasn't discovered until much later on. Now these regions are opposite in many ways other than just their names and their location on the globe, and so if we look at the Arctic first of all, and the Arctic is actually ocean surrounded by land, and so you can see here this is the UK down here and this kind of Russia and then American Canada around here, and so there is a bit of land cover in our ice on the top in the Arctic, which is Greenland here and Marcy all this area here. Surprisingly a lot of people don't realize that this isn't actually land. The North Pole isn't on land. It's just one big ocean. The lecture is all about the polar regions. First and foremost, she mentioned that the Arctic is at the top of the Earth and the Antarctic at the bottom. The Arctic was named after the Greek word for bear. Furthermore, the Arctic is actually an ocean surrounded by land, and so there is a bit of land cover in our ice on the top in the Arctic. Overall, I would like to opine that the North Pole isn't on land, it's just one big ocean.
This is a kind of object that you're probably all familiar with when you had the term robot, but I'm gonna show you the very first robots. These were the very first robots. They were characters in a play in the 1920s called Rossum's Universal Robots, and the play was written by a Czech writer called Karl Čapek. And basically, these robots, people tend to think of robots as kind of cute cuddly toys or, Hollywood depictions kind of devoid of politics. But the first robots were actually created and imagined in a time of absolute political turmoil. You just had the First World War, it finished and had a devastating impact across Europe, and so people are kind of reflecting on what does it mean to be human, what makes us human, those kinds of questions. And this kind of context is what inspired Čapek to kind of write this play. And interestingly, these robots being human, they are actually in the play assembled on a production line, a bit like the Ford manufacturing production line. So, even though they are human, they are assembled and these robots are designed to labor, and that is their primary purpose in society. The lecture is all about early robots. First and foremost, he talked about characters in a play in the 1920s called Rossum's Universal Robots, and their play was written by a Czech writer. Secondly, he mentioned that the first robots were actually created and imagined in a time of absolute political turmoil. Moreover, he explained that the play assembled on a production line a bit like the Ford manufacturing production line. Overall, I would like to say that these robots are designed to labor and manage their primary purpose in society.
Today we're going to recount heroic tales of superhuman feats of strength, when in the face of disaster. Some people are said to have summoned up incredible physical power to lift a car off of an accident victim, move giant rocks, or like Big John of Song, single-handedly hold up a collapsing beam to let the other miners escape. Are such stories true? There are many anecdotes supporting the idea, but we're going to take a fact-based look at whether or not it truly is possible for an adrenaline-charged person to temporarily gain massive strength. In proper terminology, such a temporary boost of physical power would be called hysterical strength. The stories are almost always in the form of one person lifting a car off of another. And even lifting many cars by several inches still leaves most of its weight supported by the suspension springs. But our purpose today is not to debunk any of the specific stories. The majority of them are anecdotal, and interestingly not repeatable. In many cases, the person who summoned the super strength later tried it again only to find that they couldn't do it. Basically, what we have is a respectably large body of anecdotal evidence that suggests that in times of crisis, danger, or fear, some people have the ability to temporarily exercise superhuman strength. This lecture mainly talks about heroic tales of superhuman feats of strength. In proper terminology, a temporary boost of physical power called hysterical strength are anecdotal, and not repeatable, for the person who summons the super strength cannot do the same as before. According to anecdotal shreds of evidence, some people have the ability to temporarily exercise superhuman strength, especially in times of crisis, danger or fear.
Now the economists calculated, it's a back-of-the-envelope calculation, that removing all immigration controls would double the size of the world economy, and even a small relaxation of immigration controls would lead to disproportionately big gains. Now from an ethical point of view, it's hard to argue against a policy that will do so much to help people that are much poorer than us. The famous RAND study reckons that a typical immigrant who arrives in the U.S. ends up with $20,000 a year. That's rough. It's not just the migrants themselves who gain, it's the countries they come from. Already, the migrants from poor countries working in rich countries send home around $200 billion a year, through formal channels, and about twice that through informal channels. And that compares to the neat $800 million that Western governments give in aid. These remittances are not wasted on weapons or siphoned off into Swiss bank accounts, they go straight into the pockets of local people. They pay for food, clean water, and medicines, they help kids in school, they help start up new businesses. The speaker was discussing the benefits of migration. Fiercely, he mentioned that removing all immigration controls would double the size of the world economy. In the annex, he talked about the migrants from poor countries working in rich countries send home around $200 billion a year, through formal channels, and about twice that through informal channels. To conclude, I would like to opine that this money goes to their pocket to improve their living standard.
Welcome to today's lesson. We're continuing with our study of taxonomy. Taxonomy is how scientists classify organisms into different groups based on the characteristics that they share. So, for instance, a good way to think about taxonomy is the U.S. Postal Service. If we want to send a letter to someone, we first start off by addressing it to the nation they are in. By default, we usually assume that's America, but it doesn't have to be. Could be England or Costa Rica or Spain. You put their nation or their kingdom. Then within that kingdom, you address it to a slightly more specific level, their states. So, for instance, South Carolina would be the same as a phylum. And within that state, you would address it to their city and then to their street number, the street they live on. Then you would address it to say their apartment complex, and within that complex, you'd address it by their last name to their family, and then finally their first name to the specific person you want to get it to, and in that way, we're able to weed out all the 400 million people we don't want to send our letter to in America and pinpoint the exact person we want the letter to reach. And in the same way, scientists use a taxonomy chart to pinpoint a living creature and organism and how it relates to everything else in the world. The lecturer talks about taxonomy and how scientists classify organisms into different groups based on the characteristics that they share. It's like the U.S. Postal Service. If we want to send a letter to someone, we address it to the nation or kingdom, then to their states, cities, street number, apartment complex, and finally their name. In the same way, scientists use a taxonomy chart to pinpoint a living creature and organism and how it relates to everything else in the world.
Only one country, tiny little Bhutan, wedged between China and India, has adopted the gross national happiness as the central index of government policy, and actually has a good deal of success in education and in health and in economic growth and in environmental preservation. And they have a rather sophisticated way of measuring the effects of different policies on people's happiness. But they are the only country to go that far. But you are now beginning to get other countries interested enough to do a kind of white paper policy analysis about happiness research. What effects would it have if we used it more for public policy? You are beginning to get countries like Australia, France, Great Britain that are considering publishing regular statistics on happiness. So it is beginning to become a subject of greater interest for policymakers and legislators in different advanced countries. The lecture is all about happiness. First and foremost, Bhutan is the only country that has adopted the gross national happiness as the central index of government policy. In addition to this, they have a good deal of success in education and in health and in economic growth and in environmental preservation. Furthermore, other countries are now interested in happiness research and would like to use it more for public policy. Ultimately, it is beginning to become a subject of greater interest for policymakers and legislators.
Our friends at the Highlands Museum and Discovery Center in Ashland, Kentucky, asked a very good question. Why is it dark in space? That question is not as simple as it may sound. You might think that space appears dark at night because that is when our side of Earth faces away from the Sun as our planet rotates on its axis every 24 hours. But what about all those other faraway suns that appear as stars in the night sky? Our own Milky Way galaxy contains over 200 billion stars, and the entire universe probably contains over 100 billion galaxies. You might suppose that many stars would light up the night like daytime. Until the 20th century, astronomers didn't think it was even possible to count all the stars in the universe. They thought the universe went on forever. In other words, they thought the universe was infinite. A paradox is a statement that seems to disagree with itself. To try to explain the paradox, some 19th-century scientists thought that dust clouds between the stars must be absorbing a lot of the starlight so it wouldn't shine through to us. Astronomers now realize that the universe is not infinite. A finite universe, that is, a universe of limited size, even one with trillions and trillions of stars, just wouldn't have enough stars to light up all of space. Although the idea of a finite universe explains why Earth's sky is dark at night, other causes work to make it even darker. The lecturer was discussing the darkness of the galaxy. First and foremost, she delineated that space appears dark at night because that is when our side of Earth faces away from the Sun as our planet rotates on its axis every 24 hours. In addition to this, she talked about the entire universe, which probably contains over 100 billion galaxies. Furthermore, she mentioned that the dust itself would absorb so much energy from the starlight that eventually it would glow as hot and bright as the stars. To conclude, she suggested that the idea of a finite universe explains why Earth's sky is dark at night.
Don't worry about it. Yes, it's strange. Yes, it's wonderful. But leave enough matter. 600 million years on Earth and you will have life. So the monkey sitting in the typewriter, and the chances are eventually he produces the complete works of Shakespeare. So what's the problem? He doesn't manage to do it in 600 million years. So what I decided to do is to run the numbers as instead of saying type the complete works of Shakespeare. I just ran the numbers. For how long would it take a monkey typing at one keystroke of seconds to type to be or not to be? That is the question, right? On average, how long is it gonna take my monkey friend at one keystroke a second? I don't know how long you think that would be. Maybe you can have a guess. Would it be less or more than 600 million years, which is the period life on Earth is supposed to have emerged within? And when I ran the numbers to be or not to be, that is the question, takes 12.66 trillion years to just that phrase. And a DNA string, that complexity emerged by a chance undirected within 600 million years. Again, it is mathematically possible, but it's so incredibly unlikely that it would have that it tilts me in favor of the Christian story in which God created life, simply a question of saying, let there be, and there was. The lecturer was discussing the infinite monkey theorem. Fiercely, he talked about how a monkey is able to type on a typewriter. In addition to this, if the monkeys are given a pen and paper to spell the 6-word monkey, they can only scratch on the paper. Instead of pen and paper, if they are given a typewriter, it will take them over 10 years to produce the right spelling. To conclude, I would like to opine that if they can use computer programming, they can finish the task within a day. Indeed, the library. We've all been to a historic library. We've all enjoyed the smell of a historic library. But what is it? And what does it mean? When at UCLA Center for Sustainable Heritage, we've recently been asked to access the environment at another historical library at St. Paul's Cathedral, the Wren Library, an incredible place. And it has such an intensive smell of old books. And we were also asked for the first time, really I was actually taken aback by the brief, we were asked, whatever you do, please preserve the smell. It is so important to our audience. It is so important how people perceive the library. So, that was quite an important message in our research. And indeed, smell is an important way of how we communicate with the environment. This piece of research was done by an advertising company because advertisers are so interested in how we interact with each other and the environment. And we see that the majority of people use sight obviously to interact with the environment, but on the second place, we see the smell is also very, very important. The lecturer was discussing the different types of smell in the library. To commence with, we were asked to preserve the smell of an old book in Viren library because it is so important to our audience and how people perceive the library. Furthermore, the smell is an important way of how we communicate with the environment. To conclude, the majority of people use sight to interact with the environment, but the smell is also very important.
Hello everyone, my name is Rajni and I got my desired score in PT just in 20 days. Thanks to entire team and especially Viren sir. I recommend to all of you Blossom Learning Center. PT matlab Blossom.